It was the spring of 1865, and Julia Grant was concerned about President Lincoln. She was with her husband, the Chief General over all the Union armies, Ulysses S. Grant, at City Point in Virginia. And they were pressing in on General Robert E. Lee and the Confederate troops around Petersburg and around Richmond. And she knew the pressures that Lincoln had been under as president. And she said, Ulysses, which was her nickname for him, one of her nicknames, Ulysses, why don't you invite President Lincoln to come here and to have a time of rest? And so General Grant reached out to President Lincoln, who immediately said yes. And so they sent the River Queen, one of the chief ships that went between Washington, D.C. and City Point, and they picked up President Lincoln, his wife Mary, and their son Tad, along with several other dignitaries and soldiers and so forth, and they brought them there to City Point. And by the way, their eldest son Robert was already there at the headquarters of General Grant, serving as one of his aides. They arrived, and President Lincoln had a wonderful vacation. He just enjoyed being with the soldiers, and they gave him a tour. General Grant and General Meade took him almost all the way up to the front lines, where he was able to observe the fighting. And it was actually a time where they recognized that the war was nearly over. And General Sherman came up from moving through the Carolinas with his army, and they met on the River Queen with Admiral Porter to discuss what they would do for the end of the war. And while they were there, they were going to inspect the troops, and Julia Grant was riding in a carriage with Mary Lincoln. And the year before, Mary Lincoln had suffered a terrible carriage accident where she was thrown and she hit her head. Some people think that perhaps it was that injury that caused some of her mental instability in the years after President Lincoln's assassination. But one of the general's wives was riding a little too close to President Lincoln, and when Mary Lincoln saw this, she absolutely lost her cool, and she started yelling and berating this wife of one of the generals. And Julia Grant tried to calm her down, and she wouldn't be calmed, and she started to really criticize Julie and say some very negative things like, oh, you just want to be First Lady, and you just want to be in the White House. Well, you're not going to get it, this and that, the other thing. From then on, Julia Grant kept her distance from Mary Lincoln. Fast forward a few weeks after that, and the war had come to an end, and everyone was celebrating, and Ulysses and Julia had gone to Washington, D.C., where General Grant was kind of slowing down the war, stopping the expenditures, because they were expending up to $2 and sometimes $3 million a day in 1865 on this very expensive war. And so he was starting to stop all of those things to save the country from bankruptcy, really. And so while they were there in Washington, D.C., General Grant was invited by President Lincoln to go and to be a part of the cabinet meeting and give a report on what happened at the surrender at Appomattox and to tell the story. And it was actually a really wonderful cabinet meeting, and they were very interested in what Grant did and how magnanimous he was, which of course was what Lincoln had told him to do when they met on the River Queen. And after that cabinet meeting, President Lincoln said, Mary and I are going to Ford's Theater tonight to watch a play, and we would like for you to bring Mrs. Grant and to join us for that play. Well, Ulysses knew that Julia did not want to be in that kind of situation and that close to Mary Lincoln. And so he immediately said, I apologize, Mr. President, but we have purchased a home in Burlington, New Jersey. And I want to have the camera person pan here, and this is the home. We're here in Burlington, New Jersey right now at the former home of, what had happened is that Mrs. Stanton, the wife of the Secretary of War, had told the Grants that Burlington had fantastic schools and it was from the fighting. Because prior to that, Mrs. Grant, who grew up in Missouri in the St. Louis area, had been living there at her childhood home, Whitehaven, in St. Louis, and the children, for the most part, most of them were going to school there, but they felt like things were too unstable there, and so they were looking for a place to move for the kids to go to school, and this became a convenient excuse for General Grant when he was asked for them to go with the Lincolns to Ford's Theater on that fateful night of April 14th, 1865. And so he said, "We're sorry, we're leaving this evening to take our children to our new home in New Jersey, and we won't be able to be there." And so the Grants gathered after the meeting, the cabinet meeting, and they got on a train and they came to this place. Along the way, General Grant received a telegram from the War Department, said that that night, while they were on their train ride, President Abraham Lincoln was shot, and they discovered eventually that it was John Wilkes Booth there at Ford's Theater. And the Secretary of War, Secretary Stanton, said, "Return to Washington immediately." Well, they were already well on to New Jersey, and so Ulysses brought his family the rest of the way and delivered them here to this house in Burlington, and immediately got back on the train and headed back to Washington, D.C. On the way, he received a subsequent telegram saying that President Lincoln indeed had been killed by the assassin. So Grant eventually made his way to the White House. They laid out President Lincoln in state there at the White House, and General Grant took his position at the head of Lincoln's coffin, where he stood at attention for hours and hours, and at times the tears actually rolled down his cheeks because he loved President Lincoln. And after he died, he said, without any equivocation, President Lincoln was the greatest man that I ever met. So at the same time, Julia Grant had her children placed into school, and they lived in this cottage. We'll just go this way. There's a historical marker here on the street in Burlington, and I just want you to be able to see this. It says Grant House, home of General Ulysses S. Grant's family during the last days of the Civil War, visited by Grant on day of Lincoln's death. And so this behind me is the historic house, which is now a private residence here in Burlington, New Jersey. After the Grants left this, they returned for a short time to Whitehaven in St. Louis, and then the people of Galena, Illinois had a house that is a beautiful house. It's still a museum in Galena, Illinois that you can go and visit, and they gave that house to the Grant family as a thank you. Now, one of the interesting things about that is when years later, after Grant left the White House, he became a partner in an investment firm with his son, Buck, Ulysses S. Grant Jr., and that their business partner was Ferdinand Ward, and he had been running a giant Ponzi scheme, and so they went bankrupt and they lost everything. And creditors were trying to get different properties and different things to pay off the debts that Ulysses had signed off on, unknowing that it was a giant Ponzi scheme. But they were not able to get that home in Galena. For whatever reason, however they worked out the arrangement, it was shielded from them, and so the Grants were able to keep that home. Julia had two income properties in Washington, D.C. They also had another home here in New Jersey on Long Branch at the beach. It was a shore, it was a villa, really. It was a home, but it was right on the Atlantic Ocean. And so Julia was able to sell the 2 houses in Washington, but they were able to keep the other 2 houses. And eventually, after Ulysses died of incurable throat cancer in 1885, July of 1885, the Grant family donated that home in Galena back to the city of Galena, and the city still owns that home and runs it as a museum to Ulysses and Julia Grant. But this house here, they sold at some point, and it went back into the private residency, and it still remains to this day. Many of the Grant homes are still with us, but some, like for example, the house on East 66th Street in New York City was torn down and is now a high-rise. But it's wonderful to be able to see this historic residence where the family of Ulysses S. Grant lived for a time in the last days and just after the American Civil War. I'm Craig Von Buzik, and this is Stories and Myths.